All right, everybody, welcome to today's Tech Talk Tuesday, and today's video is the final video on my Dakota Digital RTX instrument cluster installation. And for today's video, we're just gonna go ahead and give you my final thoughts on the system, the installation, how everything went, as well as how easy it is to operate the system, and whether or not I think it was worth the money to be spent on this upgrade. Of course, we can't do a long-term assessment at this point because I just got the gauges installed. Maybe in a year or so, we'll go ahead and do an update video to give you an idea of how things are holding up after an extended period of time and usage. For starters, on the overall, on the installation process, it was really simple. Of course, it wasn't as simple as installing a factory instrument cluster because it didn't interface with the factory harness with the simple plug and play on the background. So of course that was a little more involved, but the wiring standpoint was pretty straightforward, and with me doing the installation of the cluster in the dash out of the car, of course it made things really easy. And finding a location to mount the brain box, which I mentioned before, was the hardest part of the entire process. And it's not that it was that difficult to do, it's just trying to find a good spot that wasn't directly on the firewall. Took a little bit of thought in order to figure out a good place to put it. And so if that's the hardest part of this whole process, that's not that bad. And then of course the kit is pretty complete. It comes with just about everything you need. As I mentioned in the wiring video, there's about a half dozen separate wires that you have to run on your own. Those aren't that big of a deal, but if you don't have spare wire lying around, you're gonna have to go out and buy some. Again, that's not that big of a deal. It's just something you need to account for when you're going forward and installing this kit. So during the process of posting these videos, I started getting some questions from individuals that were thinking about ordering this setup or have it on order and waiting to get it. And so I thought I'd go ahead and address some of those here as well, in case you have those same questions. So for starters, with the water temperature sensor and the oil pressure sensor, you do have to run their sensors because their sensors interface with their brain box. You cannot use the factory sensors. And that said, with those new sensors, you can't run the factory harness. You have to use their harnesses that they come with. The reason is the water temperature sensor, instead of the factory one having a single wire going to it, has 2 wires, and the oil pressure sensor has 4 wires that you have to connect instead of the single wire that the factory one did. So from just that standpoint alone, with all the extra wires, it's just a lot simpler and cleaner to use the harnesses that come with the kit. Also, the plugs on these sensors are different. They're a more modern style plug, and they're not a simple solderless terminal that you're used to on the factory style setup. So you have to use their new harnesses, you have to use their new sensors, but it's not that big of a deal. You just go ahead, install the new sensors, and route the new harnesses alongside with the factory ones. And unless you're really looking close, you can't really tell that they're there. One other thing on the wiring, on the fuel sender, the factory wiring for the fuel sender is a single wire. And for the Dakota Digital, they have a recommendation for 2 wires. One that goes where the factory harness would go, right on the fuel sender for the resistance measurement, but they also have a second one as a ground that they want you to attach to the fuel sender body. And so adding that second wire is the reason why I went ahead and just ran a pair of new wires from the front of the car all the way to the back. Just that way I keep the factory harness intact. And I just went ahead and attached them to the fuel sender and called it a day. So those are the thoughts on that part of it. As from the speed sensor standpoint, it's really simple to do. They send you a speed sensor that you just go in, screw into the transmission where the factory speedometer cable goes, and then it's got a wiring harness that plugs into it and routes up back to the brain box. And it's really easy, it's really straightforward. If you want to do a GPS speedometer instead, the system is set up to accept that, but you have to go and buy that extra hardware. Now, I have heard with the GPS speedometers that if you're going through mountains and tunnels, you can lose signal, and then of course the speedometer starts acting erratically. So having the mechanical, well, electromechanical speedometer is a nice thing to have. Now, from adjusting the speedometer standpoint, it's really straightforward to do. You go ahead and you hold down the toggle switch from the system and then get the car started. Once you have that situation, the setup menu will pop up on the display. Release the toggle switch, and then you can go into the speedometer calibrations page, and you can adjust the speedometer one of two ways. They have an auto calibration method and they have an adjust method. I went ahead and did the adjust method because it just seems simpler for me, because the auto calibration one recommends having a marked off standing mile. I didn't have a marked off standing mile, but adjusting the speedometer manually was pretty easy to do. So once you've got into the adjust mode, you start driving down the road. You have a GPS speedometer app on your phone. Pull up the speed that you're going, and then you can adjust up or down the speed that's being displayed on the speedometer. And I did it in like 2 minutes. It was super easy to do and it worked out really well. One of the other nice things about this setup is if you disconnect the battery cable, all of your settings, they stay. They don't disappear. You don't have to go through the setup process again. The only thing that doesn't hold when you disconnect the battery is the clock setting. So if you disconnect your battery, when you reconnect it, you'll have to readjust the clock. But again, that's not a big deal. It doesn't take a lot of effort to go and reset the clock in these cars, or with this new instrument cluster. From an installation standpoint, it's super straightforward. I can't emphasize this enough. That was something that I was concerned about when I went ahead and ordered the system, was how difficult the installation was gonna be, how difficult the setup was gonna be, how much time it was gonna take. But at the end of the day, I really wanted this instrument cluster and I was willing to put up with whatever pain it sent me. And it was really easy. And so I'm really glad that I made this change to the car, because it really made a nice modern touch while retaining the classic look and feel of the car. And I couldn't be happier with that setup. It works out so well. Now, the biggest problem from the setup standpoint was the fuel gauge. And if you saw my video on the setup, you know that the fuel level, getting that set up was a bit of a challenge because of the 10 presets. Mopar isn't one of them, which I was surprised to find out, considering Dakota Digital has like almost a dozen Mopar specific sets of gauges for the B and E bodies. And I would have figured that one of the 10 presets would have been the Mopar one. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and so I had to go through and do the manual setup, which required pulling the fuel sender out of the tank and adjusting it at each set of marks that they have in the setup, which was 0% full, 33% full, 66% full, and 100% full. And once you do that, put everything back together, the gauge works just fine. And so it wasn't a big deal. It took an extra like 20 minutes to go ahead and pull the sender out, do the setting, put it back together. And it was not that big of a deal. Ideally, it would have been nice to not have to do that, but it's not the end of the world either. And us Mopar people are used to having stuff like this happen to us anyways, just because we are a small community for the aftermarket. And so it just goes with the territory of being a Mopar owner. I'm not that heartbroken over it. Like I said, I only had to do it once, set it and forget it, and now everything's dialed in. And then of course, when I took it out for the initial drive, after everything was dialed in, it just looks so great. I am having the gauges light up during the day as well as the night is a huge plus and really makes them stand out and look sharp while you're driving down the road. And of course, you can also set up a different light setup for the daytime as well as the nighttime. And so that's what I did, as you saw in my last video. I set up the one set of lights for the day, and I had one set up for night, and it looks great. I haven't taken the car out at night yet to see how well they light up at night, but looking at them during the day, they look pretty sharp. So I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be happy with them once it's dark out as well. So those are my thoughts on the installation and setup of the gauges. Now, from a cost standpoint, yes, they're not cheap. They're $1,500. But if you think about it, your car, if you've got standard gauges, you want to go to rally gauges, or you have rally gauges and you want to get them restored because they're not working properly, or they're faded or whatever, sending out your stock gauges to be restored is going to cost you at least $1,000, if not more, to have them restored. You can buy brand new reproduction gauges. A set of gauges is about $1,000 plus the housing. You're going to end up spending north of $1,500 on those anyways. And then if you don't have your switch bezels and your gauge bezels, you're gonna have to buy those regardless. They're gonna be several $100s. But when you're comparing the price of having your gauges already that need work and sending those out versus buying these upgrade gauges from Dakota Digital with all modern electronics, the cost is really pretty negligible which route you go. And so that was one of the reasons that I went ahead and spent the money on the Dakota Digital, is because the standard gauges that I have, while they do work, they were a little faded, and I was going to end up sending them out and having the electronics updated anyways. And this way, I went ahead and spent about the same amount of money, but I have something that's that much more modern, and I don't have the problem of being able to read the gauges at night with the overhead light bar being as bad as it is. Having everything backlit just makes everything look really sharp. Now, one of the other things that I really like about these new gauges is the factory ones, sure, give you a range of values, but they don't actually tell you what your temperature is or what your oil pressure is and things like that. And so you're just guessing that, okay, it's in this ballpark, we should be okay, maybe we're not okay. But with these new Dakota Digital gauges, they tell you exactly how much your oil pressure is that you're running, tells you exactly what your water temperature is, and since instead of having the ammeter has the voltmeter, it tells you what your voltage output is as well. And you can set warning lights to pop up as well, depending on whatever range of values you want those set at. And so there's a lot of great features in this new Dakota Digital system that you can't get out of a factory set of gauges. And so from that standpoint, it just gives you that much extra confidence in what your car is doing while you're driving it, especially if you're going out on like a long distance road trip. You know exactly what the health of your car is. And for me, that is absolutely huge, because a lot of the events that I go to, it's a couple hours or more just to get to the event. And so since it's not just driving around town, I need to know what my car's doing and make sure everything is okay. And the Dakota Digital system is great for that application as well. Now, another thing I need to note is for these gauges, you're gonna wanna have the gauge bezel that is for the 72 to 74 E-bodies, not the 70 and 71. The reason for that is, if you are familiar with these cars, the 70 and 71 style rally gauges, the reset knobs for both the trip odometer as well as the clock are in the gauge bezel itself. And in 72 to 74, those resets are in the gauge face. And these new Dakota Digital gauges, since they don't have the trip knobs and reset knobs in the bezel or on the face of the gauges, you're gonna want the smooth look of the 72 to 74 gauge bezel, so that way you don't have two open holes in your gauge bezel after you do the installation change. All right, and that's my thoughts on the new Dakota Digital RTX instrument cluster for your E-body Mopars. As I've said multiple times in this video and all of my other videos leading up to this one or surrounding the installation, these gauges are amazing. Dakota Digital knocked it out of the park. Their kit is pretty complete with some minor details here and there, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just a minor nit, and I couldn't be happier at this point because it's done and it looks amazing, and it didn't take that much effort in the first place. So if you have any thoughts, have any questions on these gauges, on anything at all, don't forget, you can go ahead and put those in the comment section below, because I read all of your comments and questions, and I want to help you out as much as I can. And if you liked today's video, don't forget to smash that like button, give us that thumbs up. It helps me out tremendously with that YouTube algorithm. And of course, you want to be kept up to date with all my future uploads, with all the projects we're going to do in the future, all the adventures we're going to go on. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button down below and ring that notification bell as well, so that way YouTube will keep you up to date of all the videos I do in the future. And as always, guys, I will see you the next video.